they're doing the last-minute PowerPoint, my name is Joan Heatherway, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I want to welcome you to our Outcomes and Assessments panel this morning. We have 4 really engaging speakers. I had the opportunity to spend some time on the phone with these folks, and really found that I learned a lot just by listening to them talk about their presentations, so I can't wait to hear them speak. We will engage in the following order, and again, these people are all introduced in your program, so I'll trust you to read their more specific data there. But we're going to start with Howard Walthall from Cumberland. Then we're going to hear from Barbara Lentz at Wake Forest. Then Rosemary Dillon from the University of Denver. And then finally, as the cleanup batter, Sue Payne from Northwestern. So I will leave it to Howard.
All right, here we go. What we want to do in the next 15 minutes is learn how to write learning outcomes and their assessments in a transactional course. So, not much time, let's get going. Background. The best practices report that you may be familiar with advocates the enunciation of learning outcomes for your course. That is a statement in your syllabus or shared with your students of what the learning outcomes are you hope to accomplish that would equip your students to practice law, which best practices says that's your fundamental goal, is to equip your students to be able to practice law. Now, the best practices report identifies 3 components of learning outcomes: knowledge, skills, values. Now, Michael Warrenoff, who's speaking participating in another panel, spoke last at the first iteration of this conference, and then wrote teaches a skills course as an adjunct, but he wrote an article that said, skills is fine, but what we want law schools to do, he's a practicing lawyer in Los Angeles doing deals, he says, I can teach students to draft a contract. I can't back up and teach them the knowledge that they need for practicing law in my area. So one of the first things that we want to be sure is that our outcomes include knowledge in that particular area. Secondly, skills may sometimes be integrated into your course, and then values, by which I mean the attitudes and the attributes and the character of a practicing lawyer. Now, the Carnegie report that you're probably familiar with turns to assessment, and it advocates moving from summative to formative assessment. The iconic paper chase involved at end of semester, in fact, in my day, involved at end of the year, 3-hour or 4-hour exam. That's summative assessment. Carnegie advocates formative assessment, multiple assessments during the course, providing feedback to the learner so that the learner has a chance to improve. See what you are modeling for them, and see what you're expecting, and then assessing various desired learning outcomes. Now, you can talk about this outcomes and this assessment at 2 different levels. One is at the law school level, and the other is at the course level. My presentation is about outcomes and assessments at the course level using a course that I teach, unincorporated business entities. Now, I suspect and hope and pray and believe that if you write learning outcomes and assessment for them in your specific courses, that's going to provide a foundation for your institution, for your law school, then to develop the outcome, the institutional level outcomes and ability to assess those institutional outcomes. So that's what I hope. That's what we're thinking about and the conversation that's going on at my school. Where to start? Answer: with your own teaching and with your own familiarity with the specific course and how it connects to what your students are going to be doing out there in practice. And you know what? You probably already know what the learning outcomes are that you are seeking, what you expect your students to take away, to go out the door and into the sunshine with those outcomes, even though in your syllabus, I know for 33 years, the way I expressed that was in terms of input, the reading assignments, or in terms of content, the coverage. What I'm suggesting is that you can take that information you already have and translate it into learning outcomes. So that's pretty easy. Then what? Organize your own ideas as to learning outcomes around these three components identified in the best practices report. And if you want a 3-point takeaway, here they are: knowledge, skills, values. Knowledge, skills, values. And then you link those concepts to equipping your student to practice law effectively when they go out the door. Boy, that was easy. But one more thing. How do you know if they got it? We call that, Sue, we call that
assessment.
Assessment. And assessment is a tougher nut. Now, in an input, content-focused approach that I pursued for over 30 years, the final exam serves as the exclusive assessment mechanism. And you know, it may still work well for assessing the knowledge piece of your learning outcomes. But when learning outcomes include skills, values, assessment becomes a lot more dicey. Go give you a specific example. I teach a course called Unincorporated Business Entities. I love it. It has it all. It has iconic cases, indeed, several of them written by Cardozo. What could be more fun? And then it has multiple generations of partnership statutes and other entity statutes. You can place technical accounting stuff of partnership accounting right next to soft fiduciary duty stuff. So that's a great base for your learning outcome. And then some of those cases could have come out differently if the agreement had been better drafted. So good chance to work on skills. And a lot of it involves what lawyers actually do. Exercise judgment, meet deadlines. So good chance to work on transactional lawyer values. So I've written some UBE learning outcomes. They're in your handout. If you want to turn to that, they're right on the first page. Look at the course objectives section in the handout, in the syllabus that's in the handout. I don't know exactly where it is. First person to find it.
It's at the back.
Pardon?
It's the back.
It's at the back. Okay. So you look at what I call course objectives. That's my old fogey word for learning outcomes. And I track the best practices report right there on the first page under course objectives, Barbara, right there on the first page. All of the components are there. Knowledge, what I want them to know when they go out the door into the sunshine. What skills I hope them to develop, and what values, attitudes, attributes of being a transactional learner. Then comes to my assessment. Well, the syllabus tries to, this is an example for you, I'm still tweaking it, links the stated learning outcomes with the corresponding assessment tools. That includes a traditional final exam. That's the ultimate assessment of knowledge. But the weekly assignments that you'll see there do that as well, and they do so formatively. Then the weekly assignments and the long draft at the end, I have them do, this year I had them do an LLP agreement. Next year I plan to do an LLC agreement. Assess their writing and drafting skills. And it has a redo feature. That's work. But it does so formatively. And the weekly assignments and the participation and the attendance develop professional goals. On the CD, you'll find my Contracts 1 and Contracts 2, my payments syllabus. And my point here is the learning outcomes you enunciate. That's not in the handout. That's on the, they told us put some of this stuff, save some trees, and put it on the CD. My Contracts 1 learning outcome, skill in case and statute analysis. All right? And my assessments there, 2 midterms and a final. Now, when I move to Contracts 2, if you take time later on, look at the CD, I do more on writing skills and working in groups. Now, I also have a syllabus for a payments course, and that's basically just 2 things. It is a knowledge of Article 3, and it's reading against statute, and there's only 1 assessment tool. All right, here's the news. Old dogs like me can learn new tricks. After more than 30 years of teaching, I've moved from an outcome-focused approach to, from an input-focused approach to an outcome-focused approach. The assessment part of it still needs a lot of tweaking, but here's my hope, here's my prayer, and that is that we as teaching law professors at the podium in the classroom can get it right before the ABA comes along and messes it all up. Barbara.
I think that's where I come in.
Okay, good.
I'm not here on behalf of the ABA. Okay, that's me. Here we go. Looks like it works. I love technology when it works. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Barbara Lentz, and I teach at Wake Forest University at the School of Law. I started teaching legal writing classes about 10 years ago, and we do formative assessment all the time. By the end of the first year, or by the end of the first week, my students have already written 3 or 4 assignments and gotten feedback. So I'm kind of used to formative assessment. I do it in my contract drafting class. And so I want to review first the standards, 3 things in my 15 minutes or so. How did we get here? There's some draft standards. I have the most recent version in the handout at the front. It's different than the April 17th that's in the handout that's stapled as part of it. That's what was current when we had to turn in everything, and now there's a new one. Okay, so how did we get here to the ABA coming to have draft standards for approval of law schools that involve learning outcomes and assessment of student learning outcomes, whether students are getting it, and also institutional effectiveness, maybe the scary part. Okay, so how did we get here? Where are we going? So we'll look at the standards very, very briefly. And what can we do? What can we do about it? How can you have formative assessment in your class all the way along and still have time to write and prepare for teaching and your institutional and service requirements, and see I have small children, I like to see them awake. How can you do all that? And so what I'm starting to do is to use multiple choice questions. And people say, you can't do that. You can't have multiple choice in a writing class. And I think that you can if you're careful about it. Okay, so how did we get here? Traditionally, law school had the summative exam. This is what I had when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I was in law school about 20 years ago. You had the exam at the end of the year, and it was usually an appendage. A lot of professors still write the exam after teaching the course during the reading period. Best practices, that's not the ideal way to do things, at least in other disciplines. It's not how med school or other higher education, secondary schools, it's not how they do that. But that's traditionally what we've done. We know that the students who are from adult learning theory, from ASP research, we know that the students who are coming to us, these millennials or adult learners, that they need feedback, they need to have self-regulation. The ABA tells us that the students need to be able to assess whether they are learning so that they can modify what they're doing. Am I getting it? They need to check their work. And especially for the generation we're getting now, we need to give them tools to do that. Socratic method works pretty well for one person to assess whether she's understanding what's going on. But especially with millennials and adult learners, it doesn't work for the rest of the class. They disengage. They're pretty passive. They like to learn by doing. They like collaboration. They need to see the relevance of their work, so formative assessments with feedbacks fills into that. They're very easily engaged, but you have to do some work to do that. Okay, so that's the type of students we have. What has the Academy traditionally done to help prepare people for assessment? AALS has a 2 or 3 day new teacher, new professor workshop, and it's got 16 to 20 hours for teaching and scholarship. Of the 16 to 20 hours, about 40 minutes is dedicated to assessment. And in that 40 minutes, you have designing tests, grading tests, course evaluations, pedagogy, all of that in that 40 to 45 minutes. At your school, if you're matched up with a mentor, you may get some feedback on assessments. Hopefully you get someone teaching, but teaching is traditionally undervalued. Especially now, the tilt is really towards scholarship. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. Okay, so that's where we are. So the ABA thinks that maybe we need to change these standards so that student learning outcomes and assessment, formative assessment, are required. How do you get faculty engaged in providing formative assessment, formative feedback? Is it really like nailing Jell-O to the wall? Well, maybe. I felt like it was just finding the current standards from the ABA was like nailing Jell-O to the wall, because they change. You know, they change weekly. And you can find all the comments, and you can find the current drafts. The May 5th draft, the materials are there. It's current until at least July, so we've probably got 3 weeks. That's pretty good. But I didn't check this morning because I go into court and I didn't shepherdize all my stuff. I don't think the ABA changed them yesterday. They weren't supposed to do anything until July. I think we're good. But I think it can be done. I think that we can engage faculty. You know, if you're here, then you're probably already buying into the fact that you're a teacher and you need to have some formative feedback, and you're trying to do that. Okay, so let's see. So where do we go? That's how we got here. And now the ABA has these standards. All right. So really briefly, as an overview, there's an objective. A law school has to maintain a rigorous educational program that does 2 things: prepare students for admission to the bar, really, and prepare students to be effective, ethical, and responsible participants in the legal profession. All right, so that's our rule. If you use Tina Stark's book, what's the standard? Because the standards kind of control things. And the standard that we have is that your student, by the time they graduate, need to have the competency of an entry-level practitioner. There's no more apprenticeship period. The law firms cannot afford to train these students. A really big law firm that's in Winston-Salem or Wake Forest isn't even trying to bill for its first years anymore. They just have in-house training because the clients won't pay. But their starting point is that we can't bill for this work, we have to train them. We'd like some help from the law school, so that's feeding into the ABA as well from the firms. Okay, so that's an objective. We've got learning outcomes. There's curriculum. 3 basic requirements for curriculum, 3 basic courses. You have to have a course in professional responsibility. You need to have 2 rigorous writing experiences. 1 in the first year, and the first year needs to be faculty supervised. The other one doesn't apparently need to be faculty supervised. Okay, a little bit more on rigor in a moment, because your contract drafting courses may be a way that your law school seeks to satisfy the upper level rigorous writing requirement. And then the third requirement is that every single student has the opportunity to do one of 3 things: experience in a live clinic, a field placement, or a simulation course. Everybody has to do one of those 3 if the current standards are adopted. That could be good news for us, because it's expensive to have smaller writing courses, but if they're required, then you have to do it. Okay, so that may be good news for us. The April draft, for the very first time, separated assessment of student learning from assessment of the institution. And did one other thing, took all the tools. What kind of assessments do you want? What things do we look at? That's not part of the rule anymore. That's in the interpretation. So there's some guidance on the type of tools that you can use for assessing your student learning or institutional effectiveness. But that's not mandatory, and that's going to vary by the school. So if you're an access school, you can use one type of thing. That's what it looks like we're doing. And if you are, if you're, I guess Brian's from Harvard. If you're at Harvard, maybe you want to pick other things. But the school gets to pick their outcomes. So that's the general format for what the standards are. Curriculum, I mentioned that you have to have a rigorous writing experience. And faculty supervised relates to the first year rigorous writing experience, but not the upper level one. So there's 2 classes that are required. And the purpose of this, we want to encourage students to have some reflection, some self-reflection. Part of being a competent practitioner when they get out is to know what they don't know, to be able to self-evaluate, to be able to work with their peers. So they have the ability to assess their performance, professionalism, and their level of competence. If I don't know, where do I go to find it out? That's our standard. Okay, rigorous. For the upper level writing requirement, what does rigorous mean? You look at the number and nature of writing projects. This is in the interpretation to 303. You don't have to meet with an instructor. It says writing instructor. It doesn't say faculty. The standard says faculty. I know from statutes that when you change, you think that when the drafters use a different word that they might have a different meaning. So writing instructor doesn't necessarily mean that the faculty has to meet with everyone in the class. You have to have an opportunity to meet with the writing instructor. We'll look at the number of the drafts produced for a writing project, and we'll think about the form of the assessment. And I included this because I think multiple choice can work if it's carefully done. So that's rigorous. How do we assess student learning? Oops. 2 things, and this is required now. A variety of formative and summative assessment methods across the curriculum for meaningful feedback. Formative is defined as assessment at different points during the course. Points is plural, so it's not just a midterm, if that's what it means. It's not just a midterm anymore. Let's see what else. And it has to be meaningful. So can multiple choice be meaningful? I think so. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big writing assignment with individualized response every single time. Okay, summative, we're pretty good at that, and we know what that means. All right. So you probably have gleaned that I kind of think that the assessment of student learning objectives, I'm buying into that one. I think that our traditional way of having an utter dearth of formative feedback during the entire course, that a student is there, and no feedback for the fall course until the end of January when you get your grade, I don't think that's ideal. So you're welcome to disagree with me. I'm still leery about the institutional effectiveness part. And the ABA wants every institution to evaluate its students. So you have goals, you have objectives for your course, and you assess whether the students are meeting those. I think we can do that, and that'll make us better teachers. The institutional effectiveness, I'm still leery about, and a lot of commentators are leery about. And faculty is reluctant, because this looks like people from outside law schools who are going to try and control what we do, or the assessment consultancy or the accountability. Is this no child left behind to learn? So we'll have to see, and this is where a lot of the fight has moved. Okay, so I'm a little more leery here. And although I showed you 301, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the ABA separated the outcome, what you do in your class assessment, from institutional assessment, except that one of the things that a school will use to assess whether it's meeting the institutional objectives are your student outcomes. So it's a little bit muddy. It's one of a long list, but it's a little bit muddy there. All right. So a very quick review of the ABA standards. No doubt if you're flying out today, you'll be waiting at Hartsfield or circling over Ohio or somewhere else. So you have another opportunity to read those, and you're welcome for the reading material. Okay, so the next part, student outcomes. What are the student outcomes for my class? For my contract drafting class, this is very broad bones what I want my students to do. There is substantive law in drafting. They need to have drafting skills. That includes revising and editing, using forms, having fluency with forms, resetting forms. They need to be able to assess their own work. Am I getting it? If I start with this form and I make these changes, what does it mean? What's the substantive outcome? They also need to be able to have peer assessment, to take someone else, because that's what negotiators and drafters do. You take someone else's draft and you comment on it civilly, and you work together. Okay. I want my students to develop, and if you heard me yesterday, develop is charitable. I want them to develop a business sense, because many of my students come to school, and if they read a newspaper or do anything, it's to watch the Daily Show, but they kind of don't know what's going on in the world. And the business world, they don't have great business sense. So one thing that we do in class is I assign reading. We read the Wall Street Journal. It can be online, that's okay. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to kill trees. But I want them to develop a business sense. Tina says, think like a deal lawyer or adding value. We do some things like that. And my students assemble a student learning portfolio, because they do have different writing assignments and editing assignments. So they have some documents by the time they leave for writing samples, and also to use in practice. I try and make it practical. So those are my outcomes. How do I know whether students get those? That's the assessment part. I think you can use multiple choice, at least for some of this, to assess whether your students are getting at least the substantive knowledge. So drafting multiple choice questions in like 2.5 minutes maybe. If you're using multiple choice questions, get a bad rep, because often they're not very well drafted. You can do it really well. There's several good articles. One is by Case and Donahue. I have a bibliography that was in the hard copy handout that you have, and you can find that reference there. Find somebody at your school or another school that's on the National Conference of Bar Examiners that helps write the multi-state bar exam. These people have gotten pretty good. But very quick rundown, and then we'll look at a sample multiple choice question, and then we'll do some fun software that hopefully will work to use polling software for multiple choice in class. Okay, so if you want to draft multiple choice, you want to use them, you have to have the right kind of topic. What topics does this mean in contract drafting? Like vagueness or ambiguity? And we have a sample of that. That's a great topic. There's some things that your students need to memorize before they can build on it. They have to memorize some law. They need to reinforce law from other disciplines. Our tendency is to wait. Traditionally our tendency is to wait for that moment when the student has memorized things and has acquired enough context that they're ready for that capstone assignment, the killer lease. And now we can jump in and do this huge deal that everyone is so excited about, the big sexy writing assignment. But if you do that, if it's the spring, and you start in January, you may not be having this big killer lease writing assignment until March. That's a long time for your students to wait and not know if they're getting it. Okay, so maybe you can use multiple choice questions along the way. So you pick your topic. You have to think of the scenario, something that's concise with common nouns, limited actors. The multi-state bar exam has some really good samples there, and also in the Case and Donahue article. You want to have a very clear and specific prompt, the question part. The question should be so focused that the student can give you the answer without looking at the options. Okay. And then distinctive choices. One is the key, that's the answer. And then you need to have some good distractors. All right, so plausible answers that call on common misperceptions. A student who doesn't really understand the difference between vagueness and ambiguity. That's a good one. Okay, and then there's some guidance on how to write and order those choices. Let's see if I can do this. So here's a sample. There. All right. So you can read the sample multiple choice question and we will assess it together to see if it works. You have somebody from WestJet Airlines. He's an executive. He's being hired by Qantas to work in New York City. The first draft of his employment contract provides for a loan of $500,000 at 4% for the purchase of a house in Manhattan. If this looks familiar, parts of it are taken from Tina Stark's book. Okay, we want to help the executive relocate. So to revise the draft, first identify the drafting error. I like putting the process in. I want my students to know about the process of revising. First, identify the error so that you are targeted in what you're doing. Don't just think that this is some stylistic. There's a substantive issue here that needs to be fixed. So identify the substantive error, and then we can fix it. Okay, so if you look at the scenario, does this work? Does it have common nouns? I don't think this is a good example. Where's WestJet Airlines located? It's WestJet says they're headquartered in Calgary, and WestJet claims to be the upstart, the favorite Canadian airline. Really? It was news to me. That information that the student needs to answer this question is not in the scenario. It needs to be in there. What other information is not in there? Look down on the options here. If you're teaching at one of the New York schools, then you probably know that a house in New York, you can't get a house in New York with a $500,000 loan unless you've got $11 million in cash somewhere else. Okay, so the price of the house. But if you're not familiar with New York, you don't know that house doesn't work. So all of the information that the student needs for this type of question to distinguish between vagueness and ambiguity is not in the scenario, and it needs to be. I do have another one that works. Okay, but the prompt then, $500,000, is that ambiguous? That works pretty well. I want you to tell me if this is ambiguous and why. The first one is actually the key. That's our answer. I don't know if the dollar sign is Canadian, United States, or Australian dollars, because the story talks about a Canadian person working in Australia moving to New York. That's an ambiguity. It's subject to more than one meaning. We can't tell. The second one is a pretty good distractor because it mentions something about contextually ambiguous. But it's incorrect because it's only contextually ambiguous if somewhere else in the document we defined it. Excuse me, that's right. It's only contextually ambiguous if somewhere else we said dollar sign means Australia. But if we define it and use it consistently, it's not ambiguous. So that doesn't work. Okay, but that might be a good distractor. C and D work really well because the student has to think what's vague and what's ambiguity, what's it mean? Oh, am I 20 minutes? Oh, no. Okay. Well,
Sorry, I hate to rush you on the fun end before we're doing that.
and the prompt doesn't work. I mean, you could have E or F, but those don't work. I mean, that's not the call of the question. Can I just show my download? Okay. So I need to do this. Sorry. Yeah, I'm a lot faster. So what else can you do? I also use these in class. I use Poll for Everywhere in class. And I have students either tweet or text or use their iPhones or their computers, and they text me the answer. This is free. You don't need clickers. It works. Doesn't work great on a Mac. I use a Mac, but it works pretty well. This is a sample from a TA training exercise. This is what I used in class. Sometimes I hand out the story so that you don't have to have a really short version with a poll for everywhere. And then you pick one of the answers, A, B, or C. And we can talk about it right there. So it's instant feedback. And the student also gets a sense of what his peers are getting. Am I wrong? Is everybody else wrong? It's a really good check. And as long as you pick your topic appropriately, it's a great way to do it. And it's free. Did I mention free? So benefits, if you've got good multiple choice questions, once you come up with them, it's a lot of work. I'm writing a book with multiple choice questions. Once you come up with them, it's really timely feedback with very little work on your part after you write them. You have to keep in mind that whatever outcomes you have for your class may be used for the institutional assessment. Okay, sorry, Linda. Thank you.
I want to apologize to my fellow presenters for having to be in and out, but we're all going to move to room 1E for the last two presenters. We have our technological problems hopefully solved down there. Sorry for the inconvenience to all of you.